Hello, everyone. Tonight we begin our descent into the dim, drafty halls of power, where velvet cloaks conceal frayed minds and golden crowns sit uneasily on trembling brows. This is not the story of gallant knights or wise kings. No, tonight we're stepping into the life of a boy who became king far too soon, in a kingdom that would come to regret their enthusiasm. Because once you walk into the glittering court of Valoria in the late 14th century, you might not walk back out. At least not with your sanity intact. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I'm doing here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is in your part of the world. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's begin tonight's journey together. It all starts in the year 1380. Picture this. The kingdom of Valoria is in mourning. King Theron III has passed, and the royal court is draped in layers of black silk, trembling with both grief and anticipation. Amid the wailing nobles and the scent of too much incense, a pale boy of 12 ascends the throne. His name is Edric the Beloved, as they'd call him later, a name that aged like milk. Young Edric was everything a storybook king should be. Chivalrous, charming, with the kind of bright eyes that made poets write bad verses. At first, people adored him. He smiled at babies. He waved dramatically from balconies. He held feasts with roasted swan and enough honeyed wine to make the chamberlains weep with budgeting anxiety. But the thing about being king at 12 is that you're not really king. You're more of a ceremonial sponge for everyone else's ambitions. While Edric paraded around on his pony, the real game was happening behind velvet curtains, in whispered corners and scroll-strewn war rooms. Still, hope bloomed. Maybe, just maybe, this cheerful boy would grow into a wise ruler. Valoria, tired from years of war and plague, needed someone to believe in. And Edric? He looked the part, dashing in his polished armor, even if he needed help buckling it. But time, as it does, moved forward, and Edric moved with it, towards something darker. Fast forward to a winter night in 1393, deep in the season when the castle stones sweat with cold, and everyone's noses are a dignified shade of blue. The court was throwing a masquerade ball, because nothing says responsible monarchy like flammable costumes in a crowded room full of bored nobles. It was called the Dance of the Wild Men, which, to be clear, was not a subtle metaphor. 6 men, including King Edric, decided to dress as forest spirits. They covered themselves in linen soaked with pitch and wax, then glued flax to their clothes so they'd resemble shaggy, mythical beasts. Yes, pitch, as in flammable tar. And then they danced, in a palace, with torches, because nothing bad ever happens when aristocrats try performance art. Among the revelers was Edric's older brother, Prince Garin, who, perhaps a few goblets deep, decided that what this scene needed was more fire. He strolled into the dance floor with a lit torch, and in a heartbeat, the entire troop of wild men became wildfires. The flames roared up their costumes like they'd been waiting for this exact moment. Panic erupted. The scent of burning wax and screaming nobility filled the hall. Servants hurled wine at the inferno. Musicians ran. The Duchess of Lysara, bless her fur-trimmed heroism, threw her velvet cloak over the king and smothered the fire clinging to him. She saved his life. 4 others were not so lucky. They died in agony, their costumes fusing with skin, their screams echoing through the marble corridors for hours. King Edric survived, physically. His skin wasn't even singed, though his pride may have suffered a few cosmetic burns. But something else inside him didn't walk out of that hall. The Ball of the Burning Men. Oh yes, they gave it a name because nothing sticks like trauma with a catchy title, left more than smoke stains on the ceiling. In the days that followed, whispers began to curl through the court like frost under a door. The king, it was said, was changed. At first it was small things. Forgetfulness, an odd giggle in the middle of a serious meeting. Then, silence. Long, long stretches where Edric would stare at a wall, motionless as if trying to listen to the stone. He told his advisors he was made of glass, not metaphorically, literally. He begged them not to touch him for fear he'd shatter. He refused to change his clothes, refused to bathe, let his hair grow into a tangled net of oil and dust, his fingernails curling into claws. Sometimes he howled in the halls at night, insisting he was a wolf. Other times he declared himself Saint Aldrich reincarnated and demanded the royal coat of arms be redrawn with a flaming sword and a halo. No one laughed. Well, not in front of him. Because this wasn't eccentricity. This was the ruler of Valoria spiraling into a waking nightmare. And in a world where the king was the government, his mind wasn't the only thing cracking. But for now, the court whispered, the nobles tensed, the people prayed. Edric the Beloved still wore the crown, but beneath it the boy was slipping further away, and he wasn't done falling. Edric IV no longer ruled a kingdom, he haunted one. Weeks after the Ball of the Burning Men, the palace corridors had gone quiet. Not the comfortable kind of quiet like a sleepy library or a cat curled beside the hearth. No, this was the tense, shuffling silence of courtiers holding their breath every time they turned a corner, half expecting to find their monarch barking at a tapestry. Because that happened. Twice. The king's descent wasn't a plummet, it was a long, strange tumble, like slipping down an endless staircase, hitting every unsettling step on the way. There were moments, brief as a candle flicker, where Edric seemed lucid. He'd smile, ask after his hunting dogs, or hum the melody of an old lullaby, but those moments were unreliable, like trying to catch mist in your hands. Most days, Edric wandered the halls barefoot, muttering about shattered bones and invisible enemies. He refused to sleep in a bed, insisting it was full of cracks. Whether in the wood or in reality itself, no one dared ask. Sometimes he stood motionless for hours, staring at his own reflection in a window, whispering, "Don't drop me, I'll splinter." When his attendants attempted to groom him, he'd recoil with a snarl. He claimed scissors would unravel his essence, and that washing would make his soul leak out through the skin. So they stopped trying. He wore the same robe for months, a matted, reeking cocoon of vermin and despair. His fingernails curved like talons, his hair became a crown of tangles, and his breath, according to a brave squire, could peel the varnish off a table. Inside the palace, nobles tiptoed around the truth. To speak of the king's madness too loudly was to invite the wrath of whichever faction claimed to speak on his behalf that week. But outside the palace, rumors spread like mold on cheese. The king had been cursed, poisoned, possessed by forest spirits, or had simply snapped from the weight of his crown. Valoria, for all its gold and glory, was suddenly leaderless. And that vacuum, oh, how it sucked. Every ambitious uncle, cousin, and former page boy with a trace of royal blood started flexing their divine right muscles. The Council of Lords fractured into camps faster than you could say Regency crisis. Fists were slammed on long tables, swords were unsheathed in council meetings. Someone threw a pie. No one could agree on who should rule, while Edric raved about butterflies made of glass. Meanwhile, outside the capital, the rest of Valoria felt the ripple. Provincial governors stopped answering summons. Taxes went missing. The royal messengers came home with bruises and new opinions about pitchforks. Bandits stopped pretending to be bandits and started calling themselves liberators. And across the sea, in the kingdom of Kaldor, rival banners began to rise like mushrooms after rain. Valoria's enemies smelled weakness, and nothing attracts opportunists like a kingdom whose king thinks he's Saint Aldrich the Flame-Kissed reborn. Back in the palace, there were whispers of exile. Maybe send Edric to a monastery? Perhaps he'd find peace among monks and herbs and things that didn't require executive function. But no one had the nerve or the political unity to act. Until one chilly morning, the impossible happened. The king had a good day. He woke up in his bed, his real bed. His voice was calm. His eyes were clear. When his steward entered, Edric looked at him and said, "Good morning, Jerome. You've gained weight." It was the closest thing to a royal proclamation the palace had heard in months. Word spread. Ministers emerged from hiding, musicians tuned their lutes. Somewhere, a cook unboxed a cake. The kingdom dared to hope. Was the king back? But like all delicate things, it didn't last. That afternoon, Edric requested the royal arms be painted in blood-red fire and doves made of tears. He announced that the sun had spoken to him and that he must never blink again. He didn't. For 17 hours. Then he collapsed in the throne room and demanded a doctor trained in dream surgery. There were no more cakes after that. Despite everything, the kingdom still tried. A rotating roster of advisors, healers, and sympathetic nobles attempted to stabilize Edric's regime. They drafted laws he'd never read, issued orders in his name, and hosted formal dinners where the king dined with an empty chair because he claimed it was occupied by the spirit of his future self. He toasted to his own ghost. Somewhere in this chaotic pantomime, Edric's son was born. Prince Roderick. The boy, thankfully, did not inherit his father's fractured grip on reality, though he did inherit his jawline and an ominous number of political enemies. Edric held the infant once. Just once. He looked into the baby's face and said, "He's made of marble. He'll be safe." Then he handed the child back and wandered off to count the imaginary birds nesting in his robes. By the time Prince Roderick was a toddler, the real business of ruling was handled by people who hadn't spoken to Edric in weeks. The monarch's name still adorned royal decrees, but everyone knew it was a fiction. Edric IV, once beloved, now merely endured. Years passed. The madness deepened. Valoria weathered rebellions, famines, and a minor invasion with all the grace of a goat wearing a crown. Through it all, the king remained, drifting between worlds, occasionally surfacing like a drowned man remembering how to breathe. Once, during such a moment of clarity, Edric wandered into the great hall and saw a grizzled knight speaking with a steward. The man looked up, startled. "Why have you come?" Edric asked, blinking as though he were waking from centuries of fog. The knight fell to one knee. "To see you, my king," he said. "It's been so long." Edric stared. Then, in a tremulous voice, he whispered, "You are one of mine, one of the true ones. Stay, please." They embraced. The moment was real, soft, human, and gone by morning. Edric no longer recognized him. He no longer recognized himself. He no longer recognized the walls around him, or the people who bowed, or the throne on which he sometimes slept curled up like a child. By the winter of 1422, his body, like his mind, gave out. Dysentery, a humiliating end for a man already broken. When the royal physicians announced his passing, the court breathed the kind of sigh one gives after a thunderstorm. Not quite relief, not quite grief. Prince Roderick, now a man, took the throne. He did not wear his father's robe. Edric IV, the beloved, the bewildered, the broken, was laid to rest in the royal crypt. His tomb read, "Here lies Edric, who once was king." And maybe, just for a while, that had been enough. Across the channel, where the sea battered cliffs with an endless sense of purpose and the fog rolled in like it had unpaid business, lay the kingdom of Eldwin. If Valoria was the fractured mirror, Eldwin was the storm cloud hovering just above it. And in 1422, just as Edric IV of Valoria was laid into his stone bed of royal regrets, a 9-month-old infant was crowned King of Eldwin. His name was Alaric. His job? Survive. Imagine being crowned before you even know what a crown is, before your teeth come in, before you understand object permanence. That's how King Alaric VI began his reign, still learning how to hold his head up while everyone else tried to hold up a kingdom. The regents came in droves, uncles, bishops, cousins with suspicious family trees, all claiming to act in the best interest of the realm, which is noble speak for, "I'd like to control the royal treasury. Thank you." Political knives came out, figuratively, mostly, and the court became less a government and more an elaborate game of who can manipulate a baby best. Little Alaric, meanwhile, was blissfully unaware. He drooled on official documents. He napped through council meetings. He threw up on a countess once. To be fair, everyone wanted to. As he grew, it became clear that Alaric was not destined to be a warrior king. He was gentle, bookish, and oddly pious for a boy who still needed help tying his shoes. He liked scriptures more than swordplay and preferred quiet contemplation to jousting tournaments. His idea of a thrilling afternoon involved translating Latin texts and correcting the grammar of royal scribes. This, as you can imagine, made him deeply suspicious to the kind of nobles who thought power should be loud and armored. By the time he was old enough to speak in full sentences and sign royal edicts without accidentally naming a chicken to the Privy Council, Eldwin was already on the brink. The nobles were restless, the peasants were poorer than ever, and the neighboring kingdoms were eyeing Eldwin like a fox eyeing a tired goose. But Alaric wasn't entirely adrift. He had dreams of knowledge, peace, and inexplicably well-structured tax reform. He founded schools. He built libraries. He established Eaton Hall and King's College Eldwin, places that, despite the odds, would outlive every sword drawn in his name. Yet kingship is not a university, and Alaric's kindness made him a poor tactician in the Game of Thrones. Every decision he made was met with skepticism. Every effort to mediate between rival houses just gave them time to reload their crossbows. And still, he smiled. Still, he prayed, and came the summer of 1453. Something shifted. On a bright morning, the king failed to appear for prayers, which was odd. Then he failed to attend council, odder. When his attendants went to his chamber, they found him sitting silently, eyes open, staring at a blank wall, not blinking, not moving. He would not respond to questions, would not eat, would not speak. The king of Eldwin had vanished inside himself. For more than a year, Alaric was a ghost in royal flesh. No expressions, no recognition, even when his queen gave birth to his heir. They placed the swaddled infant in his arms, and the king did not blink, did not flinch. He stared forward like time had abandoned him. And Eldwin noticed. With no king at the helm, the court exploded into chaos. Power vacuums do not remain empty for long, and in Eldwin, they suck in bloodlines like a drain pipe. The ancient rivalry between the House of Thorn, Red Rose, and the House of Vale, White Rose, surged back into bloom like a particularly violent flower bed. Old grudges became armed uprisings, alliances shattered like bad pottery. Everyone claimed to fight for the king, even though the king, by all accounts, no longer knew he existed. In late 1454, a miracle, or perhaps a cruel tease, occurred. Alaric stirred. He blinked. He spoke. He recognized his wife. He asked for books. The court rejoiced. There was music. There was wine. Someone brought a peacock. But the joy was short-lived. Alaric, still frail and unsteady, could not navigate the new political minefield his absence had created. Nobles now wielded armies like fashion accessories. Decisions were made before his signature dried. And worst of all, the House of Vale had had enough. In 1455, the first open clash occurred, the Battle of St. Orlan. Alaric was there in body if not in command. He was captured, not by barbarians, not by foreigners, by his own people. The House of Vale, in a twist that no one enjoyed but everyone expected, forced the king to recognize their leader, Lord Rickard, as protector of the realm, which is medieval shorthand for, "You're the king, but I run the meetings." Over the next few years, Eldwin became a pinball machine of power. Alaric was a prize. Whoever held the king held legitimacy. So they passed him around like a tragic game piece. Each time he vanished into himself, mentally, emotionally, the fighting surged anew. He would lie in bed, mute and curled like a child. He had to be fed, clothed, and gently reminded that he was, technically, in charge of a country. Even the queen, formidable and tireless, could not keep up. At one point, she led armies in his name while also raising their son and managing court politics. It was said she did all this while nursing a mild migraine and holding back tears. In 1470, a last flicker of royal luck, The queen and her allies reclaimed the throne for Alaric. He returned to the palace, but he didn't return to the world. He sat on the throne like it hurt. He wept during council. He once tried to knight a potted plant. A year later, the House of Val struck again. Alaric was deposed and thrown into the Tower of Eldwin, a place where prisoners either confessed, vanished, or went quietly mad. For Alaric, the transition was seamless. There, in a stone room that smelled of cold and resignation, he was told that his only son, his last tethered to the world, had died in battle. He did not weep. He did not speak. He simply nodded as if it confirmed something he'd suspected all along. A few days later, King Alaric VI of Eldwin was found dead. Official cause, sorrow. Unofficial whispers, murder. Unspoken truth, perhaps it didn't matter. He had left long ago, and in the empty throne room of Eldwin, the wind blew through a cracked window and no one came to close it. The Tower of Eldwin had seen many kings, but few like Alaric VI. Built from cold, unyielding stone and positioned like a permanent frown on the skyline, the tower wasn't meant for comfort. It was meant for forgetting. A place where inconvenient monarchs, ambitious cousins, and occasionally a really annoying bishop could be tucked away until time or poison took care of them. When Alaric arrived, he was not dragged in chains. He walked, slowly but willingly. His guards didn't shove him. They didn't need to. He stepped through the heavy iron doors like a man returning to a room he'd once lived in, like he expected to find his old slippers and a teapot waiting by the fire. There was no fire, just damp air echoing footsteps and a single straw-stuffed mattress that might have once terrified a rodent into celibacy. In his final months, Alaric didn't scream. He didn't protest. He didn't ask for books or pray for freedom. He simply sat quietly, like he was watching the end of a long, badly written play and didn't want to interrupt the conclusion. Those who visited him, few and far between, reported the same eerie stillness. He would greet them with a small nod, sometimes a faint smile. Occasionally he'd mutter fragments of verses or ask if the sun still rose on the other side of the tower. One guard swore he heard the king whisper, "Tell the trees I'm sorry." No one knew what it meant. No one wanted to ask. Outside the tower, Eldwin convulsed. The House of Val now ruled in full, with Lord Rickard's son, Edward, crowned as King Edward IV. The coronation was swift, almost embarrassed. There was no grand parade, no fireworks, just a declaration, a half-hearted feast, and a sense of weary inevitability. Even the pigeons on the cathedral roof looked bored. Supporters of Alaric, the dwindling House of Thorn, were either dead in exile or pretending to be very enthusiastic about Edward's policies on grain taxes. The streets of Eldwin buzzed with the false calm of suppressed memory. Everyone knew what had been done. No one wanted to say it out loud. And then the news came. Prince Elric, Alaric's only child, had died. The Battle of Toolsbury had been a bloodbath, though that was redundant for battles. Elric, barely 17, had fought bravely. That's what the official report said. Others claimed he had been abandoned by allies, betrayed by spies, or simply overwhelmed by the sheer number of enemy boots aimed at his face. It didn't matter. He was gone. The message reached the tower by sunset. The guard on duty said Alaric took the letter without a word, opened it, read it once, and then stared at the wall for hours, not crying, not speaking, just still. And then he folded the letter, placed it under his thin mattress, and lay down. He didn't get up again. On the night of May 21st, 1471, Alaric VI was found dead in his cell. His body was curled on its side, hands tucked beneath his cheek like a child. There were no signs of struggle, no wounds, no cup of poison beside the bed, just silence, and a king who, for the first time in decades, looked peaceful. The official cause of death, melancholy and profound displeasure, which is a poetic way of saying his heart gave up before the rest of him did. But Eldwin was not a poetic place. Behind closed doors, the whispers began. It was the Vale. They couldn't risk him living. Poison in the water, a pillow in the night. No one could prove it. No one would try. Because by now, Alaric was a shadow, beloved by a few, inconvenient to many, and largely forgotten by the rest. His funeral was held at dawn. No public mourning, no procession. Just a few loyal servants and a priest who didn't quite remember the proper prayer for anointed monarch turned long-term hostage. They laid him to rest beside Queen Eleanor, who had died years earlier from what polite society called exhaustion, and what her ladies-in-waiting called a slow heartbreak. The tomb was plain, no golden inscription, just 3 words carved in stone: he meant well. History, in its usual brutal efficiency, moved on. King Edward IV restructured the realm. Nobles pledged loyalty. The kingdom breathed a little easier. The archives labeled Alaric's reign as troubled, turbulent, and a cautionary tale. They wrote of his gentleness, his piety, and his inability to wield power without breaking under its weight. But somewhere, in a quiet library forgotten by time, one scholar added a note in the margin. Alaric did not fail. The crown failed him first. And that, perhaps, is the cruelest truth of all. Because not all tragedies are loud. Some end with no armies, no assassins, no screams in the dark. Some end with a sigh, a silence, and a single man lying in a cold stone room dreaming of trees that would never hear his apology. What do you do when the king loses his mind? You wait. You lie. You improvise. Because in the medieval world, the monarch was not just a man in a fancy hat. He was the law, the state, the divine voice given a very fallible set of lungs. And when that voice began muttering about invisible birds and refused to wear pants, well, you didn't fire the king. You built your kingdom around the silence. In Valoria, they whispered around Edric IV's madness like it was a contagious draft. Ministers learned to write laws in the spirit of His Majesty's intent, even when His Majesty thought he was a lamp. Courtiers invented new forms of etiquette to explain why the king barked at sculptures. One noblewoman fainted during a banquet when Edric began weeping over his soup and claimed it contained a prophecy. No one corrected him. They just quietly switched his bowl with porridge and hoped the vision changed. In Eldwin, they built entire policies atop the hollow throne of Alaric VI. Every noble warlord wrapped their ambition in a velvet ribbon of loyalty. Councils convened without him, decrees were forged in his name, and entire armies marched under the banner of a man who, on most days, couldn't recognize his own hand. They called it continuity. It was theater, a bloody, expensive theater with very bad reviews. But beneath all the rituals and reverence, people knew the kingdom was unguarded, and vultures don't ask for an invitation. Both Valoria and Eldwin suffered, not from invasion alone, but from erosion, the slow, relentless crumbling of confidence, of structure, of truth. Edric IV's madness gave rise to factionalism so vicious it cracked the nobility into bite-sized baronies. His absence of leadership didn't just weaken the crown, it invited wolves into the throne room. The war with Caldor reignited because the other side finally saw the king for what he was, absent. Alaric VI's illness didn't explode the kingdom overnight. It drained it, day by day, decision by indecision. Every time he fell into one of his catatonic states, the houses of Thorn and Vale drew swords. Every time he returned, dazed and apologetic, they sharpened them further. His reign wasn't marked by tyranny or betrayal, but by vacancy. And perhaps that's what makes their stories so haunting. History is full of monsters and tyrants. Kings who burned libraries, executed rivals, declared war for sport. But Edric and Alaric, they weren't villains. They were victims. Not of daggers or rebellion, but of a world that had no room for fragile minds. Their kingdoms expected strength, certainty, command. What they got were broken boys wrapped in velvet, each trying to breathe under the weight of a crown they never really wore. And yet, there were moments. Brief, aching moments. Edric embracing an old knight in a rare moment of clarity. Alaric smiling faintly at a servant who brought him bread. Neither man was ever truly gone, not entirely. But the parts of them that surfaced, kind, gentle, bewildered, only made the tragedy sharper, because they could have been great. had their minds held? Had the world given them help instead of hiding them? Had power been something less cruel? But that wasn't the world they inherited. In their time, kings weren't allowed to be unwell. Madness wasn't treated. It was feared, hidden, or weaponized. The people didn't burn them. They simply let them fade. Their stories for centuries were reduced to footnotes. Mad King Edric, the Lost Alaric. Easy labels, easier to forget. But now tonight, in this quiet space between dusk and sleep, we remember them, not as punchlines, not as failures, but as fragile rulers in an unforgiving age. Men who broke under the strain, and whose kingdoms broke with them. So next time you see a portrait of a solemn-faced king in a gilded frame, eyes staring into the void, remember, not all crowns weigh the same, and some carry a burden that no coronation ever prepared them for. Sleep well, dear listener, and be glad you were not born to rule. In stories, heroes arrive in shining armor. In Valoria, on that cursed night, the hero arrived wrapped in velvet and smelled faintly of lavender. Her name was Lysara, Duchess of Arlenmere, cousin to the queen, and rumored to have once slapped a bishop with a glove because he insulted her embroidery. She wasn't known for drama, nor for meekness. But that night, as chaos blossomed into fire, she did something no one else in the hall had the presence of mind, or the courage to do. She threw herself onto a burning king. Let's rewind a heartbeat. The Dance of the Wild Men had turned into a horror show. The tar and flax costumes, brilliant in concept and suicidal in execution, had caught fire the moment Prince Garen's torch brushed too close. Within seconds, the room lit up not with joy, but with panic. Men shrieked as their skins and silks caught the flame. Musicians dropped their instruments. Servants scattered. One noble fainted into a vat of wine. In the center of it all was Edric, the boy king, flailing, howling, his costume now a cage of fire. The other dancers thrashed like torches come to life, too panicked to stop, too doomed to survive. And then came Lysara. She didn't scream. She didn't hesitate. She tore off her heavy velvet cloak, lined with mink and weighted like a royal curtain, and tackled the king to the ground, smothered him in the fabric, rolling, pressing, choking out the flames until the sizzle stopped, and the only sound was Edric sobbing. 4 other men were not so lucky. They died as nobility often do in tragedy, spectacularly and with an audience. Their deaths were fast and final, bodies too scorched to be identified immediately. The stench of burnt wax and human flesh would haunt the ballroom for weeks, despite the best efforts of a dozen herbalists armed with rosemary, vinegar, and mild denial. In the days that followed, the court tried to spin the event. A tragic accident, they said, a lesson in fire safety, muttered one drunk noble. But underneath the hushed condolences and flowery proclamations, something darker lingered. The people had seen their king burn, had watched him scream and collapse, had heard him wail, not like a warrior, but like a terrified boy. And Edric had seen something else entirely. Whether it was the pain, the shock, or some hidden splinter already buried in his mind, something inside the king broke that night. Not dramatically, not visibly, but permanently. He survived. His skin was reddened, his pride deeply scorched. But his mind, it began to twist. At first it seemed like trauma, nightmares, jumping at sudden noises, refusing to go near open flames. His servants said he flinched when candlelight flickered too close. One reported hearing him whisper to a fire grate, "Don't eat me this time." People gave him space. They called it nerves, a phase, a reaction to tragedy. But then he began insisting that his skin felt thin, that his bones made the sound of shattering glass when he moved. He asked the royal physician if the castle had a glass blower of bones. When questioned, he would not laugh. And Lysara, she tried. She visited him in the days after, spoke gently, brought honeyed cakes and silk gloves, but Edric flinched from her touch. Not in fear of her, but of what she might break. "I'm fragile," he whispered once, "not in heart, in shape. They can see through me." Lysara blinked. "Who can?" "The birds," he said. "They know." It only got worse. Where once stood a boy king full of awkward charm and nervous pride, now wandered a haunted shape wrapped in royal robes and dread. The sparkle was gone. His laughter came too late, or not at all. He jumped at shadows, ducked from mirrors, and wept when his chambermaid tried to brush his cloak. He was convinced he was made of glass. He avoided hugs, banned dancing, ordered every corner of the castle padded, in case the wind throws me. It was not the madness of rage or violence. It was the soft, slow unraveling of a soul no longer tethered to the body it lived in, and no one knew what to do. Because how do you tell a king he's not transparent? How do you deny a man who commands armies and taxes that, no, he probably doesn't have crystal lungs? You don't. You bow, you agree, you whisper behind tapestries and pray he never trips on the stairs. Thus began a new chapter in Valoria's history, the Reign of Glass. Some kings rule with an iron fist. Edric IV ruled with a trembling hand, afraid it might shatter if you looked at it too hard. After the ball of the burning men and the 4 scorched nobles reduced to rumors and ashes, Edric's grip on reality didn't just loosen, it let go entirely. The boy who once loved pageants and parades began to flinch at candlelight. He avoided windows, he murmured to doorknobs, and most notably, he no longer believed himself to be a person made of flesh and blood. He believed he was glass. Not figuratively, not in some poetic, oh, he's sensitive sort of way. No, Edric was absolutely convinced that his body had been replaced by a crystalline version of himself, fragile, hollow, beautiful, and dangerously prone to cracking under stress. At first, his attendants tried to reason with him. They showed him mirrors. They brought in scholars. One physician attempted to pinch him lightly to prove he wasn't transparent. Edric screamed. For an hour, he banished the physician and issued a royal decree: no sudden movements in the presence of the crown. It was the first of many such proclamations. All servants must wear soft-soled shoes, no shouting in hallways, no musical instruments above a whisper, all mirrors to be draped in cloth, lest they reflect my breakage. All documents must be printed on silk parchment, paper scratches. He began sleeping on a bed of goose feathers, layered 12 deep, in a room with no hard surfaces. He refused armor, refused cutlery, ate with wooden spoons like a child, and drank from cups carved out of bread. He did not bathe, because water, he claimed, might dissolve me. And the hair, oh, the hair, it grew and grew. Not the majestic kind of royal hair that painters love, but the matted, oily, possibly sentient kind that made barbers weep. No one could approach him with scissors. He said the sound of cutting hair was like bones cracking. Eventually, the royal groomer was reassigned to tending palace dogs. The people, of course, had no idea what was really happening behind the golden gates. All they saw were fewer appearances, dimmer royal events, and increasing rumors. The king is ill, some said. He's fasting for religious enlightenment, said others. He's turned into a wizard, claimed one street urchin. Meanwhile, inside the palace, Edric wandered. He paced the halls at night, murmuring to paintings, wrapping himself in velvet for protection against vibrations. He avoided direct eye contact, fearing it might splinter his soul. And sometimes he simply sat in a corner for hours, whispering, "Don't knock me over." His closest advisors, at their wits' end, began to take turns pretending everything was fine. Council meetings were staged with velvet cushions lining the chamber. They sat on the floor, cross-legged like confused monks, while Edric muttered about angels whispering through the floorboards. One day he declared he was no longer Edric at all. He was Saint Aldrich the Flame-Kissed, reborn from fire and tasked with saving the realm from vibrations. He demanded a new royal seal, featuring a phoenix, a halo, and a large glass chalice. He insisted it be etched onto every document, woven into every tapestry, and tattooed onto at least one advisor. No one volunteered. The seal was made, the tattoos were quietly ignored. What could they do? He was still the king. And despite his delusions, Edric was not cruel. He didn't order executions, he didn't raise taxes for castles shaped like owls or ban all the red foods. He was kind, even gentle, in his lucid moments, but they were rare and growing rarer. The sad truth? His madness was not monstrous, it was mournful. He would look at old portraits of himself, young, dashing, arms open to crowds, and whisper, "I don't know him." Sometimes he'd find a mirror, forget it was covered, pull the cloth off, and cry. "I'm not supposed to be glass," he'd say. "I was born soft, but they burnt it out of me." And then he'd curl up on the floor, robes puddling like melted candle wax, and fall asleep. The palace learned to move around him, like workers in a cathedral avoiding the falling masonry. And through it all, the kingdom waited, because Edric IV, the boy king, the beloved, was still alive. But the man who once wore that name, he had vanished into crystal. There are few tragedies more profound than forgetting the people who love you. Not through neglect, not through betrayal, but because your mind quietly lets them slip away. For Edric IV of Valoria, the world had already blurred into a soft panic of imagined glass and muffled voices, but there remained, until this point, one flickering thread tethering him to the realm of the living: recognition. He still knew names, faces, the contours of his mother's voice, the warmth of his sister's hand. Even in his most fevered delusions, he could usually identify those closest to him, even if he insisted they were echoes in the prism. It was incoherent, yes, but there was still connection, until it was gone. It started with a council session, one of the increasingly rare ones Edric was coaxed into attending. The nobles, seated on cushions because chairs made noise and noise cracked glass, were discussing grain levies or military supply routes. Honestly, even they weren't listening anymore. These meetings were less about governance and more about maintaining the illusion that someone was steering the ship. Edric sat at the head of the circle, wrapped in layers of silk and fur like a terrified onion, eyes flicking from person to person with glazed suspicion. Then he pointed at Duke Hallwyn, his cousin, raised alongside him since childhood, and asked, "Who is that man? Why does his voice rattle my chest?" A silence fell. Duke Hallwyn smiled awkwardly. "Your Grace, it is I, Hallwyn, your cousin. We played together in the old orchard when the snow came early. You once threw a pear at my head." Edric frowned. "I don't remember that orchard." "You broke my nose." "Lies," Edric whispered, shrinking back. "I would never harm a cousin. You're not him. He had kind eyes. Yours are full of splinters." The room held its breath. It didn't stop there. The next day, he failed to recognize his sister, Lady Marilla, a woman who had nursed him through fever as a child and once tackled a rampaging deer on his behalf. She approached him with a hopeful smile and a plate of almond tarts, his favorite. He looked at her with wide eyes and said, "Do not feed me spells. I know a witch when I see one." The tarts hit the floor. Later, the queen herself entered his chamber with their young son, Prince Roderick, in tow. She had spent days preparing the moment, carefully coaxing Edric into a lucid mood, letting him rest, dressing plainly so as not to vibrate the air with too much gold. They entered the room slowly, softly. The prince, only 7, clutched a wooden horse and offered it shyly to his father. Edric stared at the boy, not with hate, not even with confusion, with nothing. "Who brought this glass doll into my chamber?" he asked. The queen flinched. "This isn't yours," Edric added, pointing to the wooden horse. "He's not yours. He doesn't belong. Get it out before it shatters." The child burst into tears. The queen did not. She simply nodded to the nursemaid, who scooped up the sobbing boy and hurried out. Once the door closed, Edric looked at his wife and said, "You were beautiful once." That was the last time she visited. Soon, every familiar face became a stranger. Every name became a suspicion. His guards rotated constantly, not because of politics, but because Edric would accuse them of being assassins in disguise if they stayed more than a week. He refused food unless it was delivered by a specific cook who spoke only in rhymes, a policy that led to several foodborne illnesses and one truly cursed batch of eels and honey. Even his own reflection became suspect. He once attacked a window with a fire poker, shouting, "He mocks me! The ghost prince mocks me!" They removed all remaining glass from his chamber after that, even water bowls. But the saddest part wasn't the fear, it was the loneliness. Because Edric didn't just forget the people around him, he began to forget himself. On one particularly cold morning, his steward found him curled up by the hearth, whispering, "I think I was a boy once." The steward, ever brave, knelt beside him. "You were, Your Grace. You played in the river, you sang off-key. You laughed when the birds stole your cake." Edric blinked slowly. "That doesn't sound like me." It was. Then I must have been someone else. And he meant it. The royal scribe stopped updating his diary. What was the point? Every entry became a loop of disconnected metaphors and phrases like, "Beware the corners," or "She has bones of frost." But even through this fog of fractured thought, tiny pieces of the old Edric would sometimes surface. One night, during a thunderstorm, he clutched the hem of his robe and whispered to a guard, "If anyone asks, tell them I tried." The guard, too stunned to answer, merely nodded. "Tell Roderick I wanted to be strong." A pause, a breath. "But I think the fire turned me into something else." Then he smiled, like a man who had finally solved a riddle no one else understood, and went to sleep. No one ever told Roderick. Because what do you tell a child about a father who no longer knows him? Who walks the halls like a half-written poem, terrified of his own echo. You say he's sick, you say he's away, you say he's the king, and hope that still means something. By the time Edric IV declared himself a saint, no one was surprised. Mildly alarmed? Yes. Deeply concerned for the kingdom's future? Also yes. But surprised? Absolutely not. The signs had been building like storm clouds over a leaky thatched roof, the muttering, the barefoot sermons, the time he asked a bishop if halos itched. Edric had been inching toward delusion for months. This was simply the grand unveiling. He made the announcement in the middle of supper. The royal court had gathered, cautiously optimistic. Edric had been relatively calm that week. No outbursts, no shrieking at candelabras, just quiet humming and long naps under furniture. So when he appeared at the high table, dressed in shimmering gold robes and a crown tilted at an alarming angle, there was a collective breath of hope. He raised a goblet of water. He no longer drank wine, too many vibrations, and proclaimed, "I am not your king." Utensils froze midair. "I am Saint Aldrich the Flame-Kissed. I have returned from fire to cleanse the realm of its brittle lies." A pause, then, "Also, we need a new flag." The hall descended into quiet chaos. Forks clattered. A duke swallowed his napkin. The royal herald tried to gently correct the king. "Your Grace, the historical Saint Aldrich died 300 years ago during the War of Withered Faith." Edric cut him off. "He burned, yes, but I was reborn. I remember the flames. I remember the holy ash. I remember the birds singing my name as the skin peeled away." No one asked what the birds sang. The next day, Edric summoned the Royal Heraldry Commission, a group of elderly men who mostly argued about lion sizes and the proper number of sword icons on banners. They arrived, terrified but intrigued. Edric presented his vision. A phoenix, wings outstretched, rising from a goblet of fire. A halo, cracked in two, hovering above it. A single tear dripping from the eye of the phoenix. And below it, in bold inscription, "Resplendo ex cineribus," I shine from ashes. "Make this the seal of the realm," he said. "Burn the old one, it lies." The heralds nodded, then promptly faked food poisoning and ran. But they were replaced. Edric found new artisans, painters, weavers, even a child with excellent handwriting, to create the new royal crest. He had it embroidered on banners, carved into palace columns, printed onto bread for morning inspiration, and tattooed onto the neck of a particularly unlucky page boy. The old seal, a noble stag crowned by the sun, was declared a lie from before the fire. All official documents bearing it were to be destroyed. "But what about treaties?" asked a terrified scribe. Edric's answer, "The fire makes new rules." He also ordered a new calendar system, beginning not from his birth, but from the date of the burning ball. "We live in the age of flame," he said. "Day 47 of Emberlight. Praise be." The court complied. What else could they do? He was still king, technically, legally. Flame spirit or not, his seal was still stamped on every coin. His voice still carried the weight of law. But behind closed doors, the nobles panicked. Some whispered that the king's madness was a punishment for past sins. Others feared divine retribution. After all, what if Edric was some reborn prophet? No one wanted to be the first to call the saint insane and get turned into a pillar of salt or poetic justice. And so the charade continued. Courtiers began using his new titles: Your Sanctified Flame, Your Reign of Embers. One noble even coined His Glimmering Grace during a banquet toast. He was later found weeping under a table, whispering, "I miss tax reform." The church naturally was apoplectic. Saint Aldrich was a revered martyr in Valorian faith. To claim rebirth as him was the theological equivalent of juggling communion wafers while singing tavern songs. The Archbishop of Maris wrote a scathing letter. Edric used it to wrap figs. The queen, exhausted beyond measure, tried to reason with him. Late at night, she crept into his chamber and knelt beside his bed of feathers. "Edric," she whispered, "you are loved, you are needed, but you are not a saint. You are my husband, Roderick's father, a king who needs rest, not reverence." He looked at her, eyes soft. "I was your husband. I was Edric, but he cracked. The glass broke. Now I hold the flame." She wept. He did not. In the days that followed, Edric's proclamations became increasingly surreal. No more roosters. They mock the dawn. The moon is watching. Paint it shut. I must be crowned again in fire with soft music. He began holding self-coronation rituals in the garden, alone, using a gold soup bowl and a handful of daisies. The gardeners stopped pruning that section. And yet, despite the absurdity, something about it was tragic. Edric wasn't cruel. He didn't call for executions. He didn't bleed the treasury for fountains of wine or giant statues. He didn't punish people for not believing. He just believed too hard. He believed in the fire. He believed he had risen. He believed that if he could just keep everyone still and quiet and soft, the cracks wouldn't grow, the world wouldn't break. And maybe neither would he. By now, the palace smelled different. Not awful, exactly, though some would argue otherwise, but different. Less like roses and myrrh, more like moist tapestry and spiritual crisis. The source of this aromatic shift? His sanctified flame himself. King Edric IV, St. Aldrich the Flame kissed, the man who had officially stopped bathing. He said water was a thief of holiness, that it diluted the fire within, that soap was a lie from the cold gods of cleanliness. And so he refused it. No baths, no basins, no perfumes, just sweat, sanctity, and the faint scent of cheese left too long beside a window. His hair, once a proud mane of golden brown curls envied across 3 duchies, had turned into something more abstract. It coiled around his shoulders in mats and clumps. Small braids appeared overnight. No one knew how. One maid swore she saw it move once. Another refused to dust near him, muttering, "It watches." Beard? Also unkempt. It grew like ivy, winding down his neck and halfway into his collarbone, where it met the tattered edges of what once was a royal robe, and now resembled a moth's rejected winter coat. And the robe. Oh, the robe. Technically, it had started as crimson velvet, embroidered with the crest of Valoria. But by this point, it had faded into a sort of suspicious taupe. Stains of uncertain origin blotched the hem. One sleeve had unraveled into fringe. The back was dotted with crumbs, feathers, and, disturbingly, what might have been a beetle family reunion. Still, he wore it daily, refused all replacements. When a chamberlain offered him fresh garments, Edric recoiled like the man had flung vipers. "You would dress the flame in ice," he hissed. "This robe carries my sanctity. Its filth is proof of trials endured." He had, in a way, developed his own theology. Dirt was divine, bugs were blessings, hair was holy, and cleanliness, a deception designed by those who feared the truth of sacred disintegration. Even the royal dogs avoided him. Servants began using codes. "The Blessed One has entered the West Wing" meant open a window, now. The infestation began, of course, with chafing and discomfort, and then came scratching, at first discreet, then constant. Soon Edric's fingers were raw from it, but he insisted this was penance from the lice of the Lord. Yes, he said that. Yes, scribes recorded it. Doctors were forbidden. Combs were destroyed. He named one louse Sir Geoffrey and claimed it advised him in dreams. This would have been hilarious if it weren't happening in the political nerve center of Valoria. Meetings grew shorter. Advisors gagged into kerchiefs. The royal chamber was regularly evacuated for incense ceremonies, which was court code for fumigation. Even the queen moved her quarters. She claimed it was to pray more deeply. No one believed her. Yet through all of this, Edric was serene. He wandered barefoot across polished floors, robes trailing, hair swirling behind him like a banner of unwashed prophecy. He sang softly to himself, tuneless melodies with lyrics like "Holy, holy, flea of dawn." He called the pigeons his messengers. He stopped using chairs. He refused silverware. He often chewed bark. But beneath the layers of filth and fervor, the man who once tried so hard to be a good king, he still flickered. Once, after frightening a page boy into tears by speaking in tongues over a bowl of raisins, he knelt beside the child and whispered, "I was afraid once too." Another time, during a thunderstorm, he stood on the balcony, hair soaked, arms raised to the sky, and simply said, "Clean me if you dare." The rain did not. The strangest part? Despite everything, despite the lice, the stench, the eccentric theology, Edric was still obeyed. Not because they believed him, but because the alternative was worse. A mad king in a robe of rags was manageable. A power vacuum? That invited war. And so, the court adapted. They built a separate wing for guests, far from the sanctified quarters. They developed a system of scented oils and counter-incense. They bribed scribes to sanitize royal decrees, and they prayed, not for Edric's health, but for his quietness. Because when he was quiet, at least no one got crowned with a pomegranate. That actually happened once. The court had grown used to the madness. It had learned to tiptoe around Edric IV's sacred robes, endure the sermon rants about louse-based enlightenment, and avoid eye contact when he declared war on the moon. Madness, in its familiarity, had become a kind of grim routine, predictable in its unpredictability. But then came the silence. And that was worse. It started one morning when the palace awoke to find Edric missing. Not missing in the kidnapped by rebels sense. He hadn't been spirited away by Calder's spies or whisked off by a celestial chariot. No, he was just gone. Not in his chambers, not in the prayer garden, not even curled under the piano in the banquet hall, a favorite haunt during low vibration days. Panic spread. Guards were summoned. The queen, pale and furious, ordered every corridor searched. It took hours before they found him, huddled inside an old wine cellar beneath the east wing, wrapped in torn tapestries, staring into the dark. No louse talk, no bird hymns, just a soft, repeated whisper, "I remember now." They coaxed him out with warm broth and a lullaby he half remembered from childhood. He said nothing for the rest of the day. The next morning, he spoke. Not in riddles, not in celestial metaphors, but like a man. "I'm broken," he told his steward, "but I wasn't always." And with that, the mask cracked. For the first time in months, maybe years, Edric seemed lucid. Not entirely, not continuously, but something had shifted. The delusion had receded, like a tide drawing back to reveal the ruined coastline. He began to speak of things long buried, of the fire, of the screams, of the smell of burning wool and skin, of Lysara's face, determined and terrified, of his own hands, shaking as he clawed at the flames. He cried, openly, without shame. "Everyone thinks the madness came after," he whispered one night to the chamberlain. But it didn't. It was already there, the fire just made it louder. In these rare moments of clarity, Edric was not the saint, not the glass king, not the prophet of the itchy divine. He was just a man. A frightened, grieving, embarrassed man who had been handed a crown before he knew how to carry it, and then dropped it again and again while everyone pretended they didn't see. He spoke of his childhood, how he had been terrified of crowds, how court lessons made him sweat, how he would hide under tables to escape the tutor's stares, how even then he had heard voices, soft, cruel things that whispered of failure and fire. "I thought it was normal," he said. "I thought all kings trembled before mirrors." He even apologized to the steward, to his old scribe, to the maid he once accused of being a fire demon. He wrote letters, never sent, to his son Roderick. "I wanted to be better. I really did. But the flames were inside before they ever touched my skin." And he hated what he'd become. Not the filth, not the lice, not even the delusions. He hated the shame. "I see how they look at me," he muttered once, scratching absently, "like I'm a story they can't tell in front of children." Then came the hardest moment of all. He asked for a mirror. It had been years since anyone dared show him his reflection. They brought him a polished silver dish, subtle, soft, unbreakable. He stared into it for nearly an hour. Finally, he whispered, "I don't know who that is," and set it down carefully like it might still shatter. The queen visited that night. They hadn't spoken properly in months. She found him sitting on the floor, legs folded, holding an old wooden toy Roderick had once left behind. "I remember your voice," he said quietly. "You used to hum in your sleep." She sat beside him, not touching. "You were kind," he added, "even when I was unbearable." "You were never unbearable," she lied. He chuckled. "A real one." "I thought I was a saint," he said. "I'm not. I know." And for a few minutes, they just existed. No fire, no madness. Just two people, tired and human. In the days that followed, the court dared to hope. He allowed his hair to be trimmed just a little. He bathed reluctantly but didn't scream. He accepted fresh robes, plain and simple. He even asked about matters of state in small doses. Wheat shortages, flooded roads, the color of the new banners. But the peace was fragile and fleeting, because for all his lucidity, Edric knew something the court refused to admit. This wouldn't last. "I can feel it," he told the steward, "like the fire is sleeping, not gone. Waiting." And he was right. By week's end, the whispering had returned. He asked if shadows could bleed. He refused to eat figs. They stare too much. He renamed a chamber pot Lord Amberpot of the West. The madness crept back, slow and cruel. But in those brief days, something had changed, not just in Edric, but in those around him. They had seen the man behind the madness, and in that man, they saw pain, kindness, regret. Not a monster, not a saint, just Edric. And for some of them, for his wife, for the steward, for the guards who had watched him spiral for years, that was enough. They didn't expect recovery. They just hoped for another day like that. Another glimpse of the boy who once laughed at birds and tried to sing to trees. Because sometimes even a single crack of light is enough to remember the sky. There is a moment in every kingdom when the court stops pretending the king is in charge. It happens quietly, like a soft crack in old stone. No declarations, no revolts. Just a shared glance across the council table, a hesitant pause before saying, "As His Grace would have wanted," and the growing realization that His Grace, in fact, no longer wants anything except perhaps to crown the cat. Valoria had reached that moment. For years, the nobles had tiptoed around Edric's madness, convincing themselves it was temporary, containable. Some even clung to the hope that divine revelation might emerge from the ramblings. But after the lice proclamations, the false sainthood, and the one memorable week where Edric renamed all days of the week, Thursday became Holy Churns Day, the court knew. This was not going away. The crown was hollow, and power, like nature, abhors a vacuum. The infighting began slowly, a whisper here, a petition there, a temporary measure proposed in a council meeting while His Grace rests. At first, they framed it as service, duty, nobles taking up the burden of governance in their sovereign's time of need. But it didn't take long before the knives came out. There were factions, of course. There always are. The House of Varel, Edric's mother's line insisted that regency should fall to Duchess Lysara, heroic cloak thrower and royal cousin. They argued her proximity to the king, her bravery, her composure made her the obvious choice. The House of Meroth disagreed. Led by Duke Halwyn, the cousin Edric no longer recognized, they believed the regency should rotate among the great houses. To preserve balance, they said, to prevent tyranny, they added. To install our man, they didn't say out loud. Meanwhile, the clergy saw opportunity. Bishop Orlin, ambitious and alarmingly fond of fire metaphors, claimed Edric's divine disorientation was proof of spiritual rebirth. The throne is now sacred beyond comprehension, he declared. Only those ordained in spirit may interpret his will. Translation: give me power. I speak fluent madness. Merchants wanted tax reforms. Generals wanted permission to crush border raiders. The queen wanted peace. And all the while, Edric wandered the gardens in his bare feet, humming about invisible bees. Council meetings became battlefield reenactments in fancy clothes. Accusations of treason flew between toasts. Scribes pretended not to hear threats whispered behind tapestries. Spies were bribed. Bribes were spied on. One nobleman tried to poison another with rose syrup, which backfired when both men accidentally drank it during a toast to continued unity. Neither died. But both passed gas so violently mid-meeting that it caused a minor evacuation. The guards called it the wind of treason. But there was nothing funny about what was happening. Valoria was fraying. Edric, technically still king, was both everywhere and nowhere. His seal still validated decrees, but half the time he used it on napkins. His voice still held weight, but now it was used to name pigeons after fruit. Without clear leadership, regions began drifting. Local lords issued their own laws. Trade routes were rerouted. Armies were summoned, just in case. The northern provinces declared they would only answer to orders written in coherent sentences, of which, they noted, His Majesty currently produces none. There were riots in the south after a tax collector claimed the king had declared eggs illegal. He had, briefly, when one hatched near him unexpectedly, and he believed it to be a spy. The palace itself became a maze of divided loyalties. Some courtiers clung to Edric's reign out of loyalty, others out of fear. Many simply wanted to ride out the storm with their necks intact, but beneath the robes and rituals, everyone knew the truth. The king was broken, and the kingdom with him. The queen, watching all of this, began to change. She had once been a beacon of quiet strength, holding court in Edric's name with dignity and resolve, but now she grew sharp, tired, cold, no longer asking for compromise, demanding obedience. She tightened the palace guard, barred certain nobles from council, whispered to generals in the moonlight. Some said she was planning a coup. Others said she was trying to save the realm. Both were probably right. One night, as Edric sat muttering about the throne's heartbeat, she asked him gently, "Do you want me to rule, Edric?" He looked at her, eyes hollow. "You already do," he said. "I'm just the candle." She did not correct him. Outside, the banners still flew, the people still bowed, but inside the palace, the throne of Valoria stood unattended, polished, golden, and quietly irrelevant. It began with an insult over wine. Duke Halwyn of Meroth, cousin to the king, proud, balding, and perpetually annoyed, had taken issue with the Earl of Cardell's choice of words during a council meeting. "You speak as if his grace were already dead," Halwyn snapped. The Earl, sipping from a goblet far too expensive for his IQ, replied smoothly, "No, my lord, just asleep, very, very deeply, possibly underwater." The room chuckled. That was the spark. By the end of the week, 3 duels had been challenged, 2 had been cancelled due to gout, and 1 had resulted in a sprained ankle and a dislocated nose on the same man. But the bruises were symbolic. The court was no longer merely squabbling, it was hunting. Power, after all, must be held by someone. And with Edric wandering palace halls naming chairs after saints, someone was going to take it, preferably with a title attached. The factions solidified fast. On one side stood the loyalists, nobles who still clung to the idea that Edric could be guided back to sanity, or at least be used as a glove putt for their policies. They surrounded Duchess Lasara, now known as the Cloak, for her famed fire-saving act and her veiled threats. On the other side stood the reformists, pragmatic, ruthless, and completely done with pretending. Led by Duke Hallwyn, they wanted Edric quietly retired and a new council-appointed regency to take over. In theory, peaceful. In practice, vicious. Petitions turned to bribes. Bribes turned to threats. Threats turned to hunting accidents. Lord Varen of Briswick tripped on a stair 4 times. His neck disagreed with gravity permanently. Lady Sertha of Norwyn was found in her garden, asleep forever beside a suspiciously empty bottle labeled rose tonic, definitely not poison. The kitchen staff developed a secret code system for nobles who suddenly refused food. Red spoon equals possible threat. Blue fork equals paranoia. Green napkin, someone poisoned the fig jam again. Servants kept their heads down and their ears open. One night, 2 guards found a message scratched into the wine cellar wall. The king is mad. The court is madder. No one claimed it. Even Edric noticed the change. Why are they louder? He asked a guard one morning. They speak with their teeth now. When told there was some tension in council, he nodded solemnly and said, "Tell them the pigeons disapprove." The pigeons, incidentally, had formed their own power block, mostly by accident. Meanwhile, the queen became a ghost with teeth. She floated from meeting to meeting, saying little, nodding often, but her eyes missed nothing. She began keeping her own ledgers, her own spies. Letters left the palace in code. Gold quietly changed hands. Arms were being counted, swords were being sharpened, because beneath the silks and ceremonies, everyone knew. Valoria was on the verge. The tension spread like mildew. Silent, sticky, unavoidable. The priest began taking sides. Some called Edric a divine test, others a divine warning. One particularly bold monk claimed the throne should be given to a man of humility and prayer. He was later found preaching to fish in the palace pond. No one knew whether to pity him or take notes. The peasants, ever astute, began stockpiling. Bread, arrows, gossip. "The king is sick," they muttered. "The nobles are hungrier than we are." And war felt close. Not the kind with marching drums and glorious flags, but the slow, creeping kind. The kind that starts in parlors and whispers behind fans and under blankets. The kind that poisons slowly like mold on velvet. No one declared it. No one needed to. By the time the autumn leaves began falling, everyone knew the truth. The court wasn't a court anymore. It was a battlefield in brocade. And Edric, he still wandered the halls, muttering poetry to cobwebs, sometimes pausing at windows to ask if the clouds were watching. On one particularly tense day, he walked into a council chamber mid-argument, looked around and said, "Does anyone else smell jam?" Everyone froze. He smiled, nodded, and left. The meeting resumed. But now, every time the wind rattled the windows, they wondered, would this be the moment the court finally shattered? Across the northern sea, where the winds bit harder and the tea had more alcohol than leaves, sat the kingdom of Kaldor. If Valoria was a land of velvet politics and spiritual delusion, Kaldor was its saltier, steelier cousin. Known for its icy cliffs, its iron mines, and a royal family that could outscowl a thunderstorm, Kaldor had never loved Valoria. The two nations had a long, passionate history of mutual dislike, complete with border skirmishes, economic sabotage, and one unfortunate incident involving a stolen wedding cake and a retaliatory goat invasion. So when Kaldor's spymaster arrived breathless at the court of King Therald II with news of Valoria's internal difficulties, the king did not blink. He smiled. "Prepare the ships," he said. "We go fishing." In Kaldor speak, this meant war, not the kind with blazing banners and poetry. Kaldor didn't do poetry. This was war made with ledgers, scouts, and quiet invasions. They'd been watching Valoria for months. Edric's madness wasn't exactly subtle. The crown had cracked, the court was cannibalizing itself, and the borders were softer than an undercooked turnip. It was tactically speaking, perfect. Caldor's plan was simple: cause chaos, exploit the chaos, and then march in pretending to bring peace. They began with trade disruptions. Caravans bound for Valoria vanished into snowstorms that smelled suspiciously like mercenaries. Northern ports, once open to Valorian merchants, suddenly needed repair. Calder gold appeared in rebel pockets. Letters were intercepted, grain shipments rerouted, entire villages accidentally burned down while their mayors were on hunting trips. And then came the false kings. Caldor sent out agents posing as legitimate heirs to Valoria's throne. One claimed to be a long-lost bastard of King Edric. Another said he was Saint Aldrich reborn, but with better hair and actual leadership skills. Both attracted followers. Both caused riots. Valoria, of course, panicked. The council split again. Should they fortify the north? Sue for peace? Offer Calder bribes or marriage pacts or large crates of sheep in exchange for silence? Duke Halwyn, now practically foaming at the mouth, screamed for mobilization. "Arm the rivers," he cried. "Boil the borders. I will not be ruled by men who wear fur inside their armor." The queen, quieter but infinitely sharper, wrote letters. Many letters. Some to generals, some to spies, some to lords whose loyalty was flexible. Meanwhile, Edric was painting birds on the ceiling. He had decided with sudden certainty that the clouds above were filled with sky librarians, and he must send them messages, using egg yolk and berries, and occasionally his own spit. "Tell them the flame still lives," he whispered to a maid. "Tell them the wind is not Calder's." The maid nodded and made a note to check if sky librarians required postage. But while Edric communed with imaginary deities, real threats marched toward his realm. Calder began massing troops near the border, claiming it was routine exercise. Their ships appeared off the western coast, monitoring fish populations. Caldor diplomats arrived in Valoria's capital with smiles made of steel and demands dressed as favors. "We merely wish to help our beloved neighbors through this unfortunate confusion," said Lord Vascan of Caldor, a man whose handshake had been described as what betrayal feels like. The court splintered again. Some nobles begged for peace, others called for war. Still others suggested handing Edric over to Caldor as a gesture of goodwill and mild embarrassment. That noble was later found trapped in a wine barrel, alive but extremely marinated. The queen stood firm. "Valoria bows to no one," she said, "least of all to cowards who strike when backs are turned." But her words carried less weight each day. The realm was already unraveling, the people starving, the nobles infighting, and the king, he stood on the palace wall at sunrise, arms spread, and declared, "I will melt the ice with song." No one argued, but many quietly began packing. The fear was real, the timing was deadly, and the sense of doom, it came like frostbite, slow at first, then all at once. Kings aren't supposed to die of diarrhea, not in the stories anyway. They fall in battle, sword in hand, roaring curses at fate. Or they're betrayed, poisoned at banquets, clutching goblets while orchestras swell. Even the mad ones, especially the mad ones, are supposed to go out in dramatic fashion, screaming prophecies, leaping from towers, or bursting into flames while declaring themselves immortal. But not Edric. Edric died in bed, from dysentery. After years of being known as the Flame-Kissed, the Glass King, the Holy One of Pigeons, he passed into history via stomach cramps and a steadily emptying chamber pot. It wasn't even a spectacular illness. No plagues, no curses, just bad water, a parasite, possibly caught from one of the many untreated wells near the palace, because Edric refused all modern treatments, claiming clean water tasted too suspicious. He deteriorated fast. At first, everyone thought it was another delusion. He stopped eating, became feverish, murmured about melting from the inside. He claimed St. Aldrich was returning to collect his bones. He asked a footstool if it had any final requests. But then the weight dropped. The skin shrank. The light in his eyes, already flickering for years, dimmed to a final spark. For once, there were no grand proclamations, no pigeons, no imaginary councils, just quiet groaning, confused blinking, and an overwhelming sense of emptiness. The queen never left his side. Even after all of it, the shame, the embarrassment, the unbearable waiting, she held his hand, wiped his brow, whispered his name again and again in case it helped him remember who he was. Sometimes he did. One night, he opened his eyes and said, "Did I do anything right?" She didn't answer. He nodded. "That's what I thought." Later, he asked for Roderick. The boy, now nearly grown, came into the room with all the awkwardness of a son who hasn't seen his father sober or sane for over a decade. Edric looked at him for a long time. "You're taller," he said. "Yes, father." "You kept the horse?" "Yes." "I hope he treats you better than I did." Roderick didn't cry. He didn't know how. The final hours were quiet, no courtiers, no scribes, just the queen, Roderick, a nursemaid, and the wind outside brushing gently against the shutters. Edric whispered something once, too soft to catch. Then nothing. When he died, the sky was a pale gray, and the palace bells rang with a tone usually reserved for bad harvests. No parades, no festivals, no mourning period announced by fireworks or gilded statues, just the slow creak of a throne emptying. He was buried not with fanfare, but with caution. Too many nobles feared the sight of his name would spark revolt, mockery, or both. The tomb inscription read simply, "Edric IV, King, may he find peace." The pigeons, no one knows why, did not appear that day. The aftermath was immediate. Within hours of Edric's death, the court shifted. Guards were repositioned. Council members reappeared from travel. Treaties were dusted off, and behind every closed door, the phrase on every lip was, "Who rules now?" The queen, regal and exhausted, had an answer. Roderick V. He had been trained for this. Quietly, in secret, away from Edric's eyes. While the king had played with birds and robes, the queen had built a future, and now it stood at the gates. Roderick Fef ascended the throne before his father's body was cold. There was no coronation, no crown, just a room of men and women too tired to fight and too scared not to follow someone. He stood at the foot of the throne, eyes sharp, jaw set. "I will not burn," he said, and that was that. But for many, the scars Edric left would linger. The nobles who had torn each other apart in whispers now scrambled to rewrite their loyalties. Old poems about the flame-kissed king were hastily edited. Portraits were touched up, removing the lice, adjusting the eyes, softening the madness. And for the common folk, he became a myth. Some called him cursed, others, chosen. Children told stories of a glass king who could see through lies. Street performers dressed in rags and declared prophecies to earn coin. Peddlers sold holy lice in tiny jars, and somewhere deep in a dusty corner of the palace, the pigeons still roosted, waiting. Because history has a short memory. But madness, it leaves footprints, and Edric's were shaped like fire. If the crown had looked too big for Edric, it absolutely devoured Alaric. Not metaphorically, physically. The royal diadem of Eldwin, an ornate thing of gold, sapphires, and centuries of bad decisions, was large enough to serve soup for 8. And now it rested, awkward and somewhat threateningly, on the downy scalp of a 10-month-old infant. Alaric VI, King of Eldwin, had just drooled on his own coronation robe. The nobles cheered anyway. What else could they do? The death of Edric IV had sent ripples through every royal house in the known world. Some wept, some panicked. Others immediately began writing letters to see who might be available for marriage in the next 10 years. But in Eldwin, a kingdom that prided itself on orderly succession and very serious statutes, the shock had hit differently. Their old king, Thalenfeth, had died unexpectedly of a heart seizure brought on by excessive porridge rage, don't ask. And suddenly, the only heir was a baby, a soft, gurgling, frequently hiccuping baby. The court went pale. They tried to spin it. The bards sang of new beginnings, of purity and promise. Priests declared the child was chosen by the stars, even though he had vomited on 2 of them. But no amount of incense could hide the truth. The kingdom of Eldwin was now ruled by someone who still believed peekaboo was sorcery, and thus began the regency. If Edric IV had ruled in madness, Alaric VI would rule in absence. The regents, an ambitious patchwork of uncles, bishops, and one very stern widow, quickly divided the kingdom into invisible zones of influence. Every decision passed through 3 arguments, 2 betrayals, and at least 1 attempt to add personal taxes to royal teething rings. The Queen Mother, Lady Aseltra, was technically in charge. She was elegant, calculating, and capable of silencing a room with a single eyebrow. But even she could not control the chaos of a court where the monarch occasionally tried to eat scrolls. Still, she tried. The royal nursery was transformed into a command center. Advisors whispered strategies between lullabies. Political threats were debated during bath time. Foreign dignitaries bowed to a child holding a stuffed duck. Alaric, for his part, seemed pleased. He liked shiny things. He liked being held. He especially liked banging ceremonial goblets against stone until someone gave him cheese. And the people? They loved him. Because babies can't lie. They can't overtax you. They can't declare war. They just exist, soft, helpless, and full of hope. And after the flames of Edric's madness, hope was a seductive thing. The streets filled with poems, Little Alaric, Light of Day, King of Gums and Glory, Heir Apparent, Drool Magnificent, merchants named bread after him. A vineyard bottled a white wine called Infant's Rule. It sold terribly. But under the lullabies and lull, the cracks deepened. Because a baby king cannot stop a war, he cannot silence dissent, he cannot see the dagger behind a duke's smile. And so the regents did what regents always do. They ruled for themselves. They passed laws in the king's name. They raised taxes for the crown. They settled old grudges under the guise of royal justice. And all the while, they bowed to the crib like it was an altar. Alaric cooed, they smiled, and the kingdom began to shift. By the time Alaric turned 10, he had read more books than most nobles read in a lifetime. Not because he was forced to, because he liked it. While other boys his age were chasing dogs or jousting with broomsticks, Alaric was curled up in a sunlit alcove, devouring treatises on law, theology, and the peculiar migration habits of swans. He once asked a visiting scholar to explain metaphysics over breakfast. The man nearly choked on his toast. He wasn't loud, or dramatic, or particularly charismatic, but he was good. He listened. He asked questions that cut deeper than most lords dared. He remembered names, he thanked servants, and above all, he was kind. The regents didn't know what to do with him. They had expected a sullen prince, or a spoiled one, or one whose only interest was in swordplay and sausages. What they got was a quiet child who preferred parchment to power and once burst into tears because he'd stepped on an ant. "He's soft," one duke muttered. "He's dangerous," corrected the Queen Mother, because a soft king who sees everything, that's a blade with no handle. At 12, Alaric founded the Eldwin Collegium, an academy that welcomed not just nobles, but commoners. He argued that knowledge should be a river, not a moat. His tutors were horrified. His regents were furious. His people adored him. At 13, he wrote a letter to a neighboring kingdom proposing a truce to end a generations-old border skirmish. It was ignored. At 14, he rewrote it, this time in their language, quoting their own poets and offering mutual scholarships. This time they listened, and so began the reign of Alaric the Scholar King. Except, he wasn't reigning. Not yet. The regency still held legal power. Every decree needed a signature from the council. Every coin, a vote. But quietly, steadily, influence was shifting because people trusted him. When there was famine in the West, he organized grain relief from the royal stores, personally overseeing distribution to ensure the lords didn't skim. When floods ravaged the Riverhold, he wrote to 30 abbeys begging for aid, and they sent it because he asked. When he walked through markets, people bowed without being told, not out of fear, but because he was theirs. The court was less enthusiastic. "He lacks strength," one lord sneered. "He lacks cruelty," another corrected, sipping bitter wine. Even among his supporters, there was nervousness. "He must learn to punish," they said. to intimidate, to wield fear. But Alaric believed in something else, not softness, stability. If I cannot be strong without cruelty, he told the Queen Mother, then I am not strong at all. She said nothing, but that night she burned a secret letter warning foreign allies to prepare for a new kind of king. Because make no mistake, Alaric was preparing. He studied war, even if he didn't love it. He learned siege mechanics, strategy, diplomatic posturing. He read every account of every uprising for the past 200 years. He interviewed veterans. He memorized military budgets. He even visited the royal armory, not to admire the swords, but to check the rust. Knowing where the blade hangs, he said once, is more useful than swinging it blind. His only indulgence? Faith. He prayed daily, not for victory or glory, but for clarity, for mercy, for the ability to see people not as enemies or tools, but as whole, flawed beings. He gave gold to monasteries, but demanded they teach reading, not just repentance. And while he never preached, people began to believe in him like one would a saint, not loud, but undeniable. By 16, he had become a shadow monarch. Ministers deferred to him before votes. Envoys requested to speak with him instead of the regents. Even his childhood tutors bowed now, uncomfortable around the boy who had outgrown them. At 17, the Queen Mother took him aside. "You terrify them," she said. He looked up from a scroll on irrigation systems. "Good. They think you'll unseat them. Not if they serve the realm." "They won't," he nodded. "Then they've already unseated themselves." And just like that, she knew. The boy was ready. But Eldwin was not, because a peaceful king is only safe in a peaceful court, and peace in a kingdom still haunted by the memory of Edric's reign was fragile. Too fragile. There was no trumpet fanfare when Alaric took the throne, no golden chariots, no rain of petals, just the soft thud of boots on stone as he walked alone down the central aisle of Eldwin's high hall, the ancient walls echoing every step like they were whispering. Finally, he was 18, tall, pale, eyes like late frost, and completely, terrifyingly calm. The regents stood in a semicircle behind him, dressed in their finest silks and practiced neutrality. They had ruled for nearly 2 decades in his name. Now, one by one, they were handing over the reins, or so they thought. In truth, most believed he'd remain a figurehead, a ceremonial leader who liked books and left the ruling to sharper teeth, a king who would ask before acting, consult before commanding. In other words, a manageable monarch. They were wrong. The ceremony was brief. The crown, refitted since infancy, was lowered onto his head. The archbishop mumbled the rites. The Queen Mother's hands trembled slightly as she passed him the scepter. And then it was done. Alaric VI, the hall proclaimed, King of Eldwin, guardian of the Vale, light of renewal. He blinked once and began to rule, not with fire, not with thunder, but with a voice like winter wind, cold, measured, and inescapable. His first decree: audit the regency. Every law, every ledger, every land grant, knighthood, and treaty signed under his name during the past 18 years was to be reviewed. Publicly. Gasps, then silence. Regents paled, but no one protested. Because Alaric smiled, and the smile was not soft. He moved swiftly. The palace treasury was bled clean of excess. Corrupt officials were dismissed, quietly, efficiently, with enough evidence to prevent even whispers of injustice. He restructured the council, fewer inherited seats, more based on merit. New ministers were drawn from scholarship halls, military ranks, and in one case, a bakery. The man had revolutionized grain storage during a drought. Alaric liked results. Still, not everyone was pleased. The Duke of Merrow, a regent who'd grown fat on war taxes, accused Alaric of overreach. Alaric invited him to a private dinner. When the Duke returned, he was pale, silent, and very eager to donate several of his estates to public education. No one knew what was said. Others tried subtler sabotage, leaking rumors, delaying votes, whispering to foreign courts that Alaric was spiritually untested or naive or bookish to the point of irrelevance. Alaric responded by showing up unexpectedly to a military exercise, outshooting the general and then reciting the names and battle histories of every soldier present from memory. The general resigned. Still, cracks formed. Because power doesn't like losing its throne, even if it never had one officially. The Queen Mother noticed it first. The changed glances in council, the messengers that never arrived, the way certain lords no longer bowed quite as deeply. "They're testing you," she warned. "I know," Alaric said. "Let them." But he underestimated their desperation, or perhaps their stupidity. One night, after a particularly tense council debate over religious reform, a toast was raised in his honor, a vintage red from Marrow. He didn't drink. He smiled, passed it to the steward, and said, "Let loyalty sit first." The steward collapsed. He survived. Barely. The investigation was immediate, brutal, thorough. 2 nobles were arrested. One confessed under pressure. The other, well, he didn't confess so much as trip repeatedly down a very long flight of stairs, backward. The message was clear. Alaric might pray for mercy, but he would not die for it. After that, the court recalibrated. No more open resistance. No more poisoning. Instead, they tried charm, flattery, gifts. They quoted his favorite philosophers badly. They named their children Alaricus. Someone even composed a 3-hour opera about the time he reorganized grain taxes. It closed in 2 nights. Alaric endured it, because now he was king, truly, and he had work to do. It happened on a Tuesday. There was no warning, no illness, no strange omens. Alaric VI had begun the day with a strategy meeting on road infrastructure, moved on to a private audience with an ambassador from Valoria, and by evening was seated quietly in the solar, reading a treatise on irrigation practices in highland marshes. Then, nothing. He didn't collapse. He didn't cry out. He simply stopped moving. His eyes remained open, breathing, steady. But he neither spoke nor reacted to anything around him. When his steward asked if he preferred duck or lamb for supper, Alaric blinked once and continued staring at the wall. They tried everything. The court physician examined him from head to toe and declared him structurally fine. The royal chaplain prayed for deliverance, sprinkling blessed oils until the entire room smelled like a holy kitchen. The Queen Mother whispered ancient lullabies into his ear. Nothing. He was not asleep, not dead, just absent. By dawn, the panic had begun. The palace was sealed. Rumors were squashed, barely. A dozen scribes were sworn to secrecy, though half had already told their cousins. The High Council met in emergency session, and for the first time in 20 years, the phrase Regency Council was spoken aloud without irony. The question wasn't, what happened? The question was, who speaks now? Because Eldwin could not be ruled by a silent king. And silence is a throne many are eager to sit on. The Queen Mother took temporary charge, citing precedent. The bishops wanted a religious tribunal. Perhaps the gods had taken his soul for divine consultation. General Tavern proposed a military interim, just until clarity returns. The Chancellor of Coin suggested a fiscal regency. After all, the kingdom is mostly budgets. In other words, vultures, all circling. Alaric remained in the solar for the first 3 days. He was moved eventually to his chambers. He resisted nothing, blinked occasionally, ate only when fed by hand. He responded to no names, no music, no prayers. It was as if his mind had stepped outside and forgotten to return. The people didn't know. Not yet. The official statement was the king is resting after prolonged exertion. But rumors began anyway. Witchcraft, whispered some. Poison, said others. Caldor's revenge, muttered those who always blamed Caldor. A few, remembering Edric, simply shrugged and said, it's the throne. It curses them. By the end of the week, a new order had begun to form. Quietly, reluctantly, but undeniably. Ministers who once deferred to Alaric began acting unilaterally. Edicts were issued in his name, but not his voice. Policies shifted, taxes tweaked, alliances reconsidered. The machine of state, ever hungry, began to operate on autopilot. But autopilots don't steer through storms. And Alaric? Still silent. A physician from the south suggested catatonic melancholia. A monk declared it a test of faith. The Queen Mother sat by his bed every night reading to him, sometimes poetry, sometimes state papers, sometimes just silence, hoping he might fill it. He never did. One night, a maid heard him whisper. She swore by every saint in the book that he said the rivers have no voice. But when pressed, she couldn't say what it meant, and the court didn't wait. They couldn't. Because across the sea, kingdoms were watching. Valoria, Kaldor, even the island states began writing letters with soft language and sharp intentions, and Eldwin without a speaking king was a kingdom without a shield. The Queen Mother doubled the palace guard. The council tripled the number of secret meetings. Everyone prepared for something. No one knew what. And above them all, in a sun-drenched room with books untouched and windows wide, sat a king who had read every answer, but left them all on the page. A prince was born, and the kingdom held its breath. The bells of Eldwin rang out at dawn, clear and hopeful. Doves were released from the palace towers. Nobles sent gifts wrapped in silk and worry. Bakers shaped bread into tiny crowns. Even the usually sour-faced chancellor of coin cracked something resembling a smile, an heir, a future. Proof that Eldwin would continue, despite everything. Queen Lyra gave birth after a long, difficult labor. She was pale, exhausted, but radiant in the way only a woman who has done something impossibly painful can be. The child, a boy, arrived red-faced and roaring, immediately declaring his presence in the world with the lungs of a general and the fists of a king. They named him Meron. It meant steadfast in the old tongue. The court rejoiced. Messengers rode across the realm. Temples held prayers of thanks. Markets overflowed with song and spiced wine. Even rival kingdoms sent lukewarm congratulations wrapped in layers of cautious diplomacy. A healthy boy. A line continued. And above all, a symbol. But the most important person didn't respond. Alaric VI, father to the newborn prince, remained still. Word of the birth was brought to him immediately. The queen herself entered his chamber, cradling Meron in her arms, tears still drying on her cheeks. She whispered his name. She told him they had a son. She placed the child gently in his lap. Alaric blinked, stared at the boy, said nothing, did nothing. The child wailed, fidgeted, reached up with tiny fingers toward the father who had once written essays on compassion, who had once quoted philosophers while tending wounded soldiers, who had once walked miles to comfort a grieving family in the countryside. That father wasn't there, just the shell. The queen didn't cry. She held her son, took him back, kissed Alaric's cheek, soft and mechanical, as if she was reminding herself this man was once her husband. Then she turned and left, shoulders squared like a soldier. Outside the chamber, the court grew restless. The king's silence could no longer be ignored. "He does not rule," whispered the nobles. "He does not speak. He does not even acknowledge his own blood." Some called for a declaration of incapacity. Others demanded the crown be passed to the queen as regent for young Meron. A few, more ambitious, suggested skipping the regency entirely. Why not a council-led monarchy? Why not them? The Queen Mother, aging but still sharp as ever, stood firm. No crown is passed while a heartbeat remains. But even she began to lose hope. Alaric's condition had not improved. No signs of awareness, no words, no recognition. The only sound he ever made was the faint hum of a song no one could identify, repeating endlessly under his breath. The lullaby of a kingdom in free fall. Outside the palace, the people rejoiced for Meron. Inside it, power began to crack again. Some ministers began conducting meetings without approval. Small laws were passed in Meron's name on behalf of the crown prince. The military quietly reorganized its command structure for stability. And in the shadows, envoys from rival kingdoms began poking at Eldwin's borders, looking for signs of weakness. They didn't find weakness. They found a void. Because without a king, without a voice, even the strongest walls begin to echo. Only the queen held the center. She ruled in practice, if not in name. She gave speeches, received diplomats, signed documents with the addendum, in consultation with His Majesty, though no such consultation occurred. She visited Alaric daily, read to him, held his hand, talked to him as though he were still the boy who once debated her on theology, who laughed at her bad poetry, who promised their child would grow up in a kingdom wiser than its past. But Alaric never replied. And in the quiet moments after the council was dismissed and the nursery fell still, Queen Lyra would sit in the shadows and whisper, "Come back." Sometimes the wind rustled, but he never did. There is a particular silence that only exists before war. It's not peaceful, it's not still. It's the kind of silence you hear in a court where no one dares speak the truth, but everyone knows it. That was the silence in Eldwin in the months following the birth of Prince Meron. Alaric VI, the silent king, still breathed, still sat, still hummed his strange, unplaceable tune. And the court, caught in the terrible space between loyalty and logic, began to turn. It began with a letter, unsigned, delivered at midnight, written in ink the color of dried blood. "The crown is empty, the cradle is full, choose now." No one knew who wrote it. Everyone understood what it meant. The factions formed almost overnight. On one side, the continuists, loyalists to Alaric. They believed the king would recover, that his silence was a divine pause, not a permanent exile. They rallied behind the Queen Mother, behind memories, behind the law. They insisted that so long as Alaric lived, the throne could not pass. On the other, the restorers, pragmatists, cynics, realists. They followed the queen, though she never openly led them. They argued that the realm could not survive an invisible monarch, that a regency under Lyra was the only sane path, and if the law needed bending, then bend it. In between them, the opportunists, smiling, waiting, the nobles who changed sides depending on who brought the better wine. The mercenaries watching with interest, the foreign ambassadors who sent coded reports back to their kings, noting just how many guards were stationed near the nursery this week. And always, always the whisper, what happens if Alaric never returns? That whisper became a scream when a grain shortage struck the southern provinces. The Chancellor of Coin, newly emboldened, signed an emergency tariff in the prince's name. The queen overrode it. The council split. Accusations flew. Parliament erupted into shouting, threats, and at one point, a duel challenge involving a roasted goose. The goose was fine. The Parliament was not. And then came the spark. In a quiet town called Carden's Hollow, a minor lord refused to pay taxes, claiming Meron was not his king. When a local magistrate tried to enforce the law, the villagers rioted. The manor burned. 6 guards were killed. Within a week, 3 nearby lords declared neutrality in the question of the crown. The queen sent troops, the queen mother begged restraint, the troops were ambushed, the civil war had begun. It wasn't declared. It didn't need to be. It was a war of letters, of symbols, of stolen seals and fake decrees. Armies didn't march under banners, they marched under whispers. Soldiers didn't wear uniforms, they wore old loyalties like armor. Brother against brother, noble against noble. And through it all, the palace tried to pretend. Alaric still sat in his chamber, a royal silhouette behind silk curtains, occasionally moved from one chair to another so that the people wouldn't panic. His guards still bowed, his servants still murmured, "Your Majesty." But outside his door, his kingdom bled. The queen became steel. She no longer read to Alaric, she no longer waited. She led meetings, issued orders, and watched as friends fell and foes multiplied. The Queen Mother broke. She wandered the halls, weeping, praying, accusing the wind, tearing pages from old books looking for signs. One morning she stood in the throne room screaming, "Speak! Say something! Anything!" Alaric didn't hear her, or didn't care, or wasn't there to hear anymore. In one final desperate effort to prevent total collapse, the queen announced a royal procession. Prince Meron, still an infant, would be shown to the people, a sign that the crown endured, a symbol of hope. The child was paraded through cities under guard, in a cradle of carved oak, beneath a banner that read, "The light continues." The people clapped, they smiled, they tossed petals and whispered blessings, but behind the cheers they asked the same question, "Where is the king?" And the silence again had no answer. Alaric blinked. It was that simple. After nearly 2 years of silence, of humming, of stillness, of breathing without being, he blinked. It happened at dawn. The palace physician had just finished his daily check. Pulse, breath, pupils, no change. Same as yesterday. Same as the day before. He turned to go, then paused, because Alaric's eyes weren't staring at the ceiling anymore. They were following him. "Your Majesty," he whispered, no response. But the king blinked again. Word traveled faster than fire. By mid-morning, the queen had rushed to his side. She found him sitting up, weak, pale, but unmistakably awake. He looked at her like someone emerging from a long, painful dream. "Lyra," he said. Just one word. Her name. It shattered something inside her. She fell to her knees and wept, not from joy, but from exhaustion, because this was the man she had mourned while he lived. And now he had returned, but to what? The court rejoiced. On the surface, they sent letters to every corner of the kingdom. The king has awakened. Priests held vigils, bells rang again, fireworks exploded in some cities, poems were scribbled, bread prices spiked, no one knows why. But inside the palace, terror. Because kings don't return from absence. Not like this, and not to this. The queen had ruled in all but name. Her supporters were many. The child prince, Marin, had become a living banner. Nobles had made alliances. Some had made wars. And now, the rightful king had returned. With questions. Lots of them. Alaric was slow to speak, but when he did, it was with the same calm precision as before. "What year is it?" he asked. They told him. He nodded. "How many dead?" No one answered. So he started reading. Everything. Decrees, letters, reports, battle maps, medical files, treasury scrolls, interrogation transcripts, even poems. He locked himself in the library for 3 days. When he emerged, his hair was longer, his beard uneven, and his eyes full of something ancient. Regret. Not fury. Not vengeance. Just the heavy, bitter weight of knowing the world had spun without you and taken pieces of you with it. The queen met him in the solar. "I kept your kingdom alive," she said. "I know," he replied. "I ruled. I made decisions. I would have made many of the same ones." "Then why are you here?" That silenced them both, because the truth was no one knew what to do next. Alaric was king, legally, spiritually, symbolically, but the people had moved on. So had the nobles. Even the army had taken new oaths. Eldwin didn't need him, and that terrified everyone, including Alaric. He began attending council meetings again, quietly, observing, occasionally asking questions that cut straight through a week's worth of debate. He walked the palace gardens, listened to servants, held his son for the first time, and wept silently into the child's hair, but he did not reclaim the throne. Not yet. Because reclaiming it would mean tearing it away from those who had kept it warm. And Alaric had no taste for violence. Instead, he proposed a solution. He would serve as advisor, royal council, shadow monarch. He would teach, guide, support, but not reign directly. Not until Marin came of age, not unless asked. Some called it weakness, others, wisdom. But everyone knew one thing: the war wasn't over. Because while Alaric read in the library and spoke in parables, others sharpened knives. Alaric tried. He truly did. He met with ministers, old and new, sat through debates without flinching, offered counsel without pride. He never pulled rank, never demanded back the crown. He taught economics to young pages, mediated disputes between landholders, donated half his personal wealth to rebuild war-torn villages. But goodwill is a currency with a short lifespan, and some debts never get paid. To his supporters, Alaric was a symbol of reason, of restraint, proof that leadership could be gentle, deliberate, and deeply human. To his enemies, he was a ghost sitting in the throne room, uncrowned but unavoidable. He did not punish those who rose during his absence, but they punished themselves, with paranoia. Because every time Alaric asked a question, they wondered, does he know? Every quiet nod, every stroke of his quill felt like a test. They began to whisper that he was building a secret court, that he'd gathered spies, loyalists, priests, and poets to reshape the realm from behind closed doors. A silent coup, they called it. Of course, none of it was true, but fear rarely waits for proof, and neither does ambition. The Chancellor of Coin, still bitter from losing control of tariffs, began rallying the merchants, painting Alaric as archaic, detached, a threat to growth. He quietly suggested to guildmasters that a shift in leadership could bring favorable reforms. The general of the South, once neutral, was caught in correspondence with a border baron known for treasonous leanings. The letter mentioned the advantage of clarity, a phrase many believed referred to Meron being named king, officially and immediately. Even some among the queen's advisors began to falter. He watches too much. He says too little. Is he waiting to strike? Lyra knew the truth. Alaric wasn't planning a coup. He was afraid of one, because if he acted too soon, he'd shatter what little peace remained. If he moved too slowly, someone else would act for him. And so, the palace, once a place of certainty, became a place of angles. Conversations behind curtains, maps rolled and unrolled, guards reassigned at odd hours. The queen tried to hold the middle. She hosted dinners. She showed Meron to the public. She assured everyone over and over that the crown was steady, that all decisions were shared between her and Alaric. But no one believed her. Not really, because belief needs action, and Alaric, still walking with ghost-quiet steps, offered only words. One day, he stood before the council and offered a plan for land reform. Modest, fair, beneficial to both nobles and commoners. It was elegant. They voted it down, not because it was flawed, but because he proposed it. That was the turning point. The next morning, the guard outside Alaric's quarters was replaced without his approval. His letters began arriving late. Some never arrived at all. One of his closest advisors was found dead. Heart failure, they said. But his heart had been perfectly healthy last week. Alaric didn't flinch. He simply moved his desk nearer the window and began writing. Journals, laws, warnings, letters to Meron, sealed and dated for the future. Records of everything, because if history was about to repeat itself, he wanted there to be no doubt this time. And as the sun set on the palace that week, a single phrase began to appear, scrawled on walls and alleyways, whispered in marketplaces. The king is awake, but is the kingdom? It began with a whisper. A single phrase slipped into a merchant's ledger, disguised as inventory code. Midwinter, Tower Hall, silence. No one knew who wrote it first. No one claimed it. But within a week, the phrase was echoed in wine cellars, in hunting lodges, in guild meetings, and drawing rooms where no one poured their own drink. Tower Hall, Eldwin's oldest keep, long used only for ceremonial feasts, had been quietly cleaned, restocked, and reserved. Reserved for what? No one asked, because they already knew. It was a coup, not loud, not with swords, not yet, but with signatures, with forged decrees, with carefully phrased transitions of stability. The plan was elegant. Declare Alaric unfit, cite his long silence, his perceived instability, frame it not as betrayal, but mercy. He deserves rest, they'd say. He gave us everything, now let him heal. Then raise Meron, the child king, unquestioned, unopposed, with the queen as official regent and guardian of continuity. Most would accept it, some would cheer. Only one person had to be removed quietly, Alaric, not killed. No, too messy, just disappeared. Exiled to a monastery or a quiet estate in the north, or if necessary, a more permanent silence. He wandered into the night, the poets might write. The scholar king returned to the stars. But Alaric wasn't sleeping anymore. He knew. Not the full plan, but enough. The sudden quiet among his advisors, the missing guards, the day he found his personal ink well filled with watered pitch instead of black dye, a subtle insult used centuries ago to mock blind kings. He'd seen this pattern in books, kings who waited too long, who trusted too much, who believed reason could survive ambition. So Alaric made a decision. He wouldn't stop them, not directly, not yet. Instead, he sent letters, one to the queen, short, gentle, not accusatory. Just one question. When did you stop believing I would return? She didn't reply. One to the Queen Mother. He asked her to remember the oath she made when he was 10, kneeling beside his bed after a fever, whispering, "Whatever happens, I will protect your right to choose." She wept reading it, said nothing, and one more. To his son. It would not be opened for years, but it was written with care. In it, Alaric explained how power must never be given to those who seek it too eagerly. That silence can be weaponized. That ruling means seeing the world as it is, not as you wish it to be. And then, he waited. The night of the gathering arrived. Midwinter. Cold, the sky cracked with frost. Tower Hall glowed with candlelight. Nobles arrived in cloaks heavy with fur and heavier with purpose. The queen was not present, but her seal was. So was the chancellor, the general, 3 high lords, a bishop, even the master of horses, who no one had invited but always showed up when something was dying. They gathered around a long, polished table and read the decree. Simple, inevitable. Due to continuing psychological decline and extended absence from effective governance, His Majesty King Alaric VI shall hereby be relieved of his duties and the crown transferred in trust to Prince Maron under the regency of Queen Lyra. No objections, just nods. Quills dipped. The first signature fell like a stone, then another and another, until a knock, soft, rhythmic. Everyone turned. The great doors of Tower Hall creaked open, and Alaric entered alone. No guards, no sword, just robes, clean but unadorned. No crown. He walked slowly to the head of the table, said nothing, just looked. One by one, eyes met eyes, some glanced away, others stiffened. The chancellor opened his mouth. Alaric raised a single hand, silence. Then, calmly, he reached into his sleeve, pulled out a parchment, unrolled it, and read. Not poetry, not threat, proof, records, letters, secret missives, stamped orders, surveillance reports, even a payment ledger, unfortunately signed by the chancellor himself, listing transport of one uncooperative royal. He laid them on the table. "You forgot," he said quietly. "I never stopped reading." The room froze, then a different knock. Guards, not palace guards, city guards, common folk, veterans, ward captains, men and women whose sons Alaric had helped feed during the famine, whose wives he had defended from unlawful seizure, who still remembered the quiet boy king who'd shown up in the mud and listened. They entered without drawing weapons, just stood. Behind Alaric, he looked at the table. "You may proceed," he said. No one moved, not for a very long time. When they finally did, it was to stand, silently, leave their quills on the table, and walk out. All but one, the Queen Mother. She came forward, took his hand, and whispered, "You waited too long, but you came back in time." Alaric didn't smile, but his eyes closed, and for once, his silence wasn't terrifying, it was earned. The kingdom expected a coronation. They prepared for banners, for declarations, for the triumphant return of the king. But Alaric had other plans. He ruled for 1 more year, 12 months of calm, of careful healing. He did not purge his enemies. He did not seek vengeance. He reinstated some policies, revised others. He promoted several young ministers, quiet minds, clear eyes, people who reminded him of himself before the silence. He held council twice a week. He walked among the people every morning. He even laughed. Once, it startled the court, but there it was. Soft, crooked, real. It happened when Maron, now toddling around the palace like he owned it, interrupted a war briefing by announcing that dragons are not allowed in meetings. Alaric looked at his son and realized something. The kingdom didn't need him anymore, and that was good. He spoke with the queen, not as rivals, not as co-regents, but as 2 people who had once loved each other in a quieter life. They walked the gardens, talked for hours. No decisions were made that night. But in the days that followed, preparations began. On the first day of spring, Alaric summoned the court. He wore no crown, no scepter, just a wool cloak and a small silver brooch, the emblem of Eldwin's first scholar king, long before steel replaced ink. He stood before the throne and didn't sit. "I have ruled in silence," he began. I have ruled in sorrow and I have ruled in service, but I no longer wish to rule in fear. He looked at Marin. The boy was drawing on a cushion with ink, unbothered, unburdened, perfect. I step down not because I am unfit, Alaric said, but because I wish to remain so. He turned, placed the brooch on the throne, and walked away. No applause, no shouts, just a soft wind through the banners, and one voice from a guard near the door, whispering, "Thank you." Alaric did not vanish. He moved to the Western Isles, a monastery with no name where he taught philosophy, wrote books on statecraft, humility, and the dangers of forgetting. He received no visitors, except one. Each spring, Marin came, they talked, laughed, read together, and when the boy was 16, he asked, "Do you regret it?" Alaric smiled, "Only the days I didn't listen." He died in peace, no fanfare, no funeral, just a ripple in the quiet, and the people of Eldwin never forgot. Not because he conquered, not because he ruled, but because, when the time came, he let go, and in doing so, saved them all. And now, the fire is out, the halls are quiet, and our story has found its final breath. But before you slip away into sleep, I want to hear from you. What would you have done standing in Alaric's boots? Would you have fought to reclaim the throne or walked away as he did, choosing peace over power? Did his silence feel noble or terrifying? Share your thoughts in the comments. I read every one of them like they're old scrolls in the Royal Library. And if this journey through the shadows of Eldwin stirred something in you, consider subscribing. Not because some algorithm demands it, but because you want to walk beside me through more forgotten histories, hidden kingdoms, and strange truths that feel far too familiar. So hit that subscribe button if you haven't already. Like the video if Alaric's story meant something to you. And don't forget to share where you're watching from and what time it is in your corner of the realm. Until next time, my fellow Midnight Wanderers, dim the lights, take a breath, and let your dreams carry you somewhere new. I'll be waiting with the next story. Good night.